The Art of Happiness is a series of books I co-authored with the Dalai Lama on the topic of happiness. But as things evolved over the years, I came to use that term also to represent a particular approach to cultivating happiness in a broader sense. And that approach combines and integrates certain key Buddhist principles and practices with the science of happiness. Now, one of my goals when I first started working on this book project with the Dalai Lama was to look through the scientific literature and try to find studies that supported his views on happiness, or refuted, as the case may be. And what I found was that I found a few good studies that supported his views. I couldn't find anything that refuted his views, but mostly there was an absence of evidence one way or the other. This was years ago, before the birth of positive psychology. So when Martin Seligman and a group of researchers established formally the field known as positive psychology, it ignited an explosion of interest in the subject among the scientific community. And gradually, over the years, I noticed that one of the important trends in happiness research was looking at Buddhist techniques, various meditation techniques and their effects on a person's happiness, and looking at other parameters. And I thought that was an exciting development, and it wasn't an accident, I think, that they started becoming more and more interested in that field, because in one series of studies done by Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, he basically discovered Tibetan Buddhist monks to be the Olympic champions of happiness. He'd identified a certain area of the brain in the left prefrontal cortex associated with happiness, and then brought a bunch of ordinary Americans in to measure the level of activity in that area of their brains to get kind of a baseline average. And then he brought in some Tibetan Buddhist monks. The first one was a guy named Mathieu Ricard. And he found that the level of activity in their happiness region was off the charts. I mean, way above the ordinary Americans. So that certainly piqued their interest. And when they started investigating Buddhist techniques, various meditation techniques, it was clear that there was a convergence of Buddhism and science going on. And it reminded me how years ago, this is around the early 90s, I read a quote by a very influential British historian, a guy who specialized in the rise and fall of civilizations. And towards the end of his life, he lived throughout most of the 20th century, so he had a unique perspective as a historian. They asked him, "What do you think is the most important event of the 20th century?" And he responded, the coming of Buddhism to the West. And when I read that, I was amazed because it didn't seem to me like Buddhism was going to have a huge impact in Western civilization. Certainly, the counterculture movement, there are people studying Buddhism, friends of mine, and so on, but it didn't look like a society-changing event. But when years later, Buddhism and science started converging, it occurred to me that it may have a huge impact. It's already had an impact in the field of positive psychology, the science of happiness. And it may have a wider impact in society, just like I think that the science of happiness is going to have a huge impact, I hope at least, in the West. So I have sort of theory that what we're witnessing right now in our lifetime is the birth of a brand new form of Buddhism for the first time in 1,500 years, which I call Western Buddhism for want of a better term. But I think it could have a pretty big impact based on the scientific research that's been going on and could have a much wider effect. So I'm going to be curious what happens in the coming years. But anyway, what I thought I'd do today is briefly touch upon a couple of Art of Happiness principles and try to address the theme of this year's Happiness Summit, which is connection. And I think that's a great topic they chose. For the last 2 days, expert after expert has been identifying our relationships, our connection to others, as a key factor in human happiness. So it's a good topic, although what a lot of people haven't mentioned is that, yes, it's true that our relationships can be the richest source of human happiness. In fact, it's a requirement for a happy life. But also, our relationships, anybody who's gone through a bad marriage or gone through a divorce or had a really bad boss or a coworker that you feel like slapping knows that our human relationships can also provide the greatest source of aggravation and misery. So the question is, how can we cultivate good relationships, solid relationships? What's the most effective way of connecting with other people? And in reflecting on that question, it brought to mind a conversation I had with the Dalai Lama years ago. This was in 1993 and took place in Arizona, which is where I'm from. And we had invited the Dalai Lama to give a week of Buddhist teachings. And as one of his hosts, I arranged to meet with him every afternoon when his teachings were finished and begin our series of discussions for our book project. And so on one of the days, he was running a little bit late. So I went down to the lobby of the hotel where he was staying and sat down, and on an end table next to me, there was a copy of the local alternative newspaper, and it was turned to the personals section. I mean, today, if people want to meet somebody, they're looking to date somebody, whether it's a serious relationship or just a sexual hookup, they use the internet. But in those days, they would place personal ads in these local papers that were handed out for free. And as it happened, I forget, but maybe about a week prior to that, I'd read an article about the dramatic increase in loneliness in our society. Its prevalence was definitely on the rise. And so, with that in mind, as I was reading these ads, I sort of became absorbed because it was page after page of these tiny ads that were densely packed, and it evoked a sense of yearning for connection on a wider scale in our society. So I was sort of thinking about these type of things when the Dalai Lama was ready to meet, and I went up to his hotel room, and on the spur of the moment, I decided to lay down my clipboard with all my carefully prepared questions and topics I wanted to discuss. And instead, I asked him, "Do you ever get lonely?" And at that time, I'd known him for about a decade, a little over a decade, and so I was certainly familiar with his personal history. And I'd always imagined, because of his circumstances in life and responsibilities and position, I'd always imagined that he had probably experienced a unique kind of isolation throughout the course of his life. So I expected him to say something like, "Of course, Howard, every once in a while I experience some loneliness," and then my game plan was to ask him how he deals with loneliness when it arises. But instead he said, "No." And I said, "You never experience any kind of loneliness?" He said, "No." So I said, "Well, what do you attribute that to?" And he said, "Well, when I meet people, even if it's somebody who I'm meeting for the first time, I feel a sense of affinity and connectedness. So I don't really worry about whether they like me or not, or what they're thinking about me, or whether they're judging me. And that makes things easier." So I thought for a second, what must it be like to be so comfortable in your own skin and so comfortable with other people, even total strangers, that you don't even think about, do they like me? What are they thinking about me? And that type of thing. So I asked him, "Well, how do you develop that feeling of affinity and connectedness that you're talking about?" And he said, "The main thing is I recognize the importance of compassion. The idea that compassion isn't something sentimental or silly, but it has great practical value. So if I approach others with the thought of compassion in my mind, it opens an inner door." That's how the expression that he used. "And through that inner door, through that openness, it opens the possibility of a positive interaction, a positive exchange. And even if a positive interaction doesn't take place, it leaves open that possibility for the future." So obviously, compassion was an important topic for him, particularly as a Mahayana Buddhist. And for the rest of that meeting, we stuck on that same subject. And at the end of the meeting, the upshot was, in terms of how do you connect with other people, it was the case that he said, relationships can be based on all sorts of different factors. It can be based on, physical attraction or sexual attraction. It could be based on common interests or shared childhood experiences or common work goals. There's a million things that can form the basis of a relationship, and there can be more than one at the same time. But he said that if the foundation of your relationship is based on compassion, and you have a sense of compassion in mind, that's a way to connect with the other person, and it results in a much more stable relationship, and overall, much more meaningful, beneficial relationship. And that was his key to connecting with others, is through empathy and compassion. And there have been studies that show, Buddhist meditations on compassion not only increase a person's customary level of happiness, but also improve relationships. So what I thought I would do is give you a couple of the important principles related to the art of happiness, and particularly compassion. Because after that one meeting, it's not like we ended our discussion. As a matter of fact, for the next several years, intermittently, we would return to that important topic. And what I gradually discovered was that his view of compassion and the customary Western view of compassion were very, very different. Even beginning with the very word compassion, it took me years to recognize that, well, he was using the English word as a translation for the Tibetan word, and the Tibetan word had some big differences. One difference was the Tibetan word for compassion includes self-compassion. That's built into the definition. It's intrinsic to their view of compassion, whereas in the West, we think of compassion as something directed towards other people, and self-compassion is kind of a different topic, which we haven't talked a lot about in our society until recently, and I think the field of happiness science has had something to do with increased interest in self-compassion. But there's so many important differences, it's beyond my scope to go through them all today, but I just want to mention as kind of important takeaway points of his view of compassion, the art of happiness view of compassion. One point is, from his perspective, just like happiness, compassion is seen as learnable, as a trainable skill. It's a very different view of compassion than in the West. And the other point that I wanted to mention was one of the fundamental principles of the art of happiness, which is there's an inextricable link between personal happiness and kindness, compassion, and caring towards others. And this is a bidirectional link. Studies have shown that happier people are more compassionate, more willing to reach out and help other people. And there's some great studies I wish I had time to talk about, supporting all these ideas I'm talking about today. Usually I love talking about studies, but I'm looking at this clock here, 6:10, 6:09, 6, So where, okay. And the reverse is true also. The deliberate cultivation of kindness and compassion are powerful strategies to increase personal happiness. And as a result of that, I'm sure most of you guys know this huge list of personal rewards and benefits of happiness: better health, greater longevity, better career success, better, increased resilience, on and on and on. So if the practice of compassion and kindness increases happiness, which it does, all these other personal rewards are going to go along with it. So the question is, if compassion is so important in connecting with others, and if it is a learnable, trainable skill, how exactly do you go about cultivating greater compassion? So from the art of happiness perspective, the methods to increase happiness are based largely on the Buddhist model of training the mind. So in this context, there are specific meditations that have been designed to increase our sense of empathy or our sense of compassion. So, for example, the Dalai Lama is a big fan of a practice called Tonglen. Are any of you familiar with that? A few people. Basically, you imagine taking on another person's suffering, transmuting it, and then sending them all of your positive resources and strengths, and so on. There's a series of meditations on our interdependence, which is a hugely important topic in and of itself, but the result of those meditations increases a person's sense of connection. And like a well-known one is called the metta practice or loving kindness meditation, and it can also be a compassion meditation. And there's been a number of studies on that, one by Barbara Fredrickson, showing that it really is effective in increasing happiness, improving relationships. And interestingly, the subjects who practiced this meditation, it wasn't subject to hedonic adaptation. The more you practice, the more benefit there was. So I found that sort of interesting. In fact, I talked to an undergraduate, I think she was at Georgetown, who said she was involved in helping. They're doing a whole bunch of experiments on this metta practice and, doing brain scans, which I don't think Barbara Fredrickson did. So it'll be interesting to see the results. The studies are going on right now. But the question is, are there any other strategies? And I thought I would leave you with one. I have 3 minutes left. I don't know if I can get through this. But it's a great exercise, a great practice. It's based on the idea and the truth that in order to practice compassion, first you have to have empathy. Because compassion comes from the root words calm, meaning with, and passion, meaning to suffer. So it involves opening up oneself to another's suffering, and then the next stage is wishing them to be free of their suffering, and the final stage is, if your compassion is strong enough, you'll be motivated to reach out and actually do something to help that person. But how do you increase empathy? Well, the common practice in Western science when they're doing studies on empathy is perspective taking, imagining yourself in another person's shoes. And that's effective, it's been shown. But from the Art of Happiness perspective, it's not the most effective practice because it's based on using one's imagination, imagining what it would be like to be that individual. And really, it's hit or miss because you're not really that individual. So it's based on guesswork. But another more effective technique, I call the least common denominator technique, borrowing the term from mathematics, which is recognizing the most fundamental characteristics and traits that you share with every human being. So just like I don't want to suffer, that person doesn't want to suffer. I want to be happy, and that's something that joins us all. We all want to be happy. We want to be loved, or we want to find somebody to love. So it involves analyzing and reflecting on the common traits that we share with other people, and then practicing reminding yourself of that deliberately and consciously. So this type of exercise comes under the heading of an analytic type of meditation because you use your reasoning and investigation. And we think of mindfulness as the most famous Buddhist technique that's being applied in the West, but the Dalai Lama is a much bigger fan of analytic meditation. So what I recommend to the people that I work with in my happiness training program, when I work privately with people, is when they're in a crowded place, pick out people at random, discreetly, so people don't freak out that you're staring at them, and remind yourself, that person wants to be happy just like I want to be happy. That person doesn't want to suffer just like I don't want to suffer. That person doesn't like pain and sorrow just like me. So you remind yourself of the common traits that you share with people, and when you practice that over and over and over, it begins to have a profound effect because you relate to others based on the reality of the situation, which is another key Art of Happiness principle. The more you perceive reality accurately, the happier you are. And it provides a basis for connecting with others, and that's the theme of today is connection. And if I'm sort of condensing it, but if you go out and practice that a little bit, after a while, it becomes part of your default mode of viewing other people and your relationship to them. And it's a means of really connecting with people on the most profound, fundamental level, and you can feel it intuitively. But you have to practice for a while. 0, I made it.